and subtle plot elements were fleshed out, but the overall story was unchanged. All of the classic jobs returned, some reflected their more modern titles, and Onion Knight was now a bonus job, as the orphans began as freelancers. Guests also aided the party on rare occasions instead of merely tagging along. After their sprites were preened and polished a record 4 times, few imagined that Square Enix would consider a 5th remake to be in order. But with the handheld market opening up beyond Nintendo's empire, Final Fantasy I and II arrived on the PSP in the summer of 2007 to celebrate the original's 20th anniversary. The widescreen upgrades looked better than ever, crammed in all of the content from the PS1 and GBA iterations, and featured even more bonus quests and spells. While these revisions have come with new dungeons, difficulty levels, and archived information, they've also received adjustments to their dialogue and narration. When dealing with fantasy names and mythological references, words do not translate directly. Making sense of squares is an ongoing source of debate among the Final Fantasy community, and the scripts are constantly being revised and updated to more correctly reflect the original Japanese content. This has been both enlightening and alienating to fans of other languages, as certain aspects were corrected from previous mistranslations, while the others were obscured by concepts that had little to no meaning when translated more accurately. Back in the infancy of Square's role-playing empire, memory and coding requirements were legitimate hurdles for naming and text. This affected both Japanese and English audiences and led to changes such as Goblin being referred to as Imp in the original and several subsequent fantasies. This also forced the early storytellers to work with very limiting dialogue space. Complex emotions and relationships were very challenging as characters couldn't express themselves to their imagined limits. This wall was removed as technology developed, and the ports of the original games were given more complicated lines of dialogue than their predecessors. Along similar lines, some concepts translated more loosely than others. This allowed for greater specificity for certain recurring themes in future games, as well as remakes. This could be as simple as Shiva's signature attack, now known as Diamond Dust, originally being titled Gem Dust, or as complicated as the etymology of the Dark Knight ability Soul Eater, originating as simply as dark or darkness. When dealing with names or famous mythological creatures, the sound profiles of different languages came into play. Translators may not have been initially aware of this issue, which led to certain characters or places having subtle mistranslations in earlier versions. A single letter or sound may have been changed, such as the original kingdom of Corneria in Final Fantasy being corrected to the more anglicized Cornelia. The Fiend of Fire in the first game, Kari, was probably initially intended to be named Kali, after the destructive Hindu goddess. However, she received the moniker Malorus from her Final Fantasy IX incarnation for Origins and Dawn of Souls. Certain sounds that exist in some languages do not exist in others, or may be represented by different letters or combinations. This, in addition to early memory restrictions, turned the translation of certain creatures into a guessing game of sound recognition. Sometimes notorious monsters were translated correctly nearly all of the time, such as everyone's favorite floating eye being named for the Persian demon, Ahriman. Some were more challenging, however. Thus, the creature from 6, first translated as Humbaba, had no seeming connection to anything in recognized lore. Add the correctly translated Humbaba, and the beast took its place among the many facets Final Fantasy borrowed from the Babylonian tradition, in this case, most specifically, from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Oftentimes, when dealing with myths of other cultures, sounds that exist in the original language cannot be duplicated at all or even approximated. Then, when translated into other languages, the new forms lacked the sounds from either the parent or the core translation. The end result was a word that barely resembled what was intended. This game of translation telephone is seen in the 4 fiends from Final Fantasy IV, who were originally meant to be a reference to Dante's Inferno. Scarmiglione, Barbaricha, Cagnazzo, and Rubicante were all devils known as Malabranche, who dwelled in the 5th ridge of the 8th layer of Hell, Malabolge. A number of sounds in the Italian language became lost when translated into Japanese, and even more were lost on its first translation into English. It may be easy to see how Rubicante became Rubicant, or even how Barbaricha became Valvalis. However, without all of the pieces to the puzzle, Milon bears little resemblance to the original Scarmiglione. Some concepts were deemed too risque for American audiences in the early stages of Final Fantasy. This begot translations with religious-free concepts, dialogue, and abilities, among other things. An example of this from Final Fantasy IV was the exclusion of Rosa's Pray ability and the change of holy to white. These were corrected for the GBA port. However, not all of the updated translations made universal sense. With the US release of Final Fantasy VIII, the spell system switched from a progressive numeric system to the one with various suffixes the franchise had been using from the start. Fire 2 and Fire 3 became Fira and Firaga. Nearly all of the remakes adhere to this newer system of naming spells, changing the names of many magic attacks to reflect their modern nomenclature. Whether or not this made sense in the Japanese language, it changed the English system from one that showed progression to a system that made no categorical sense when translated and created nonsense forms of actual words. Final Fantasy is not the only series to be remade several times, but it has received more ports than anything else, 17 so far. And those don't include the original localizations, which had language discrepancies fans wouldn't become aware of for another decade. But just like Square is eager to start drawing on a blank slate with each new Final Fantasy, they're also willing to admit when they've made a translation goof, and work continually to get closer to the original version. This means there might still be hidden meanings out there that those with a command of both English and Japanese have yet to discover. Join us next week for the stirring conclusion to Game Trailer's 13-part retrospective. In the final installment, we'll build a Final Fantasy game from scratch, considering all the necessary elements that make up a chapter in this landmark series, and look forward to what the future holds for the franchise.